Hi YouTube, my name is Aria and I want to talk about Stranger Things in this video, specifically about the characters of Mike and Will and their relationship. Looking at all the post-finale reactions or reviews, I find that there's so much ignorance and misconception or even really horrible prejudice within the fandom surrounding this relationship and its shippers and our grievances with how the writing ultimately handled their story. And to be honest, when I think of crazy reactions like that one teenage girl who's crying because we didn't get to see Mike and Will get nasty with each other, then yeah, I kinda get the haters. But then again, I think it's really unfair to only look at that tiny, unhinged part of the Byler fandom and just assume that they represent all of us. They don't. Everyone can see the obvious flaws in the writing quality, the amount of plot holes and inconsistencies, unsatisfying character arcs, and so on. And everyone rightfully criticizes them, of course. In fact, I ironically come across new posts pointing out plot holes I didn't notice before every single day, ever since the finale. But barely anyone talks objectively about or even recognizes the queerbait and homophobia in the writing in this show, and the real hurt that this has led to. The homophobes are hating on this season, and a certain part of the fandom, to be honest, and they're calling it too woke. But general audience viewers are mocking it for much of the same reasons. No one is recognizing or even looking at the underlying issue here, which is the fact that this show was written by two straight guys who only wrote their misguided interpretation of what they think good representation looks like, and didn't even allow any queer voices to correct them. And this doesn't only apply to the minority of queer characters, by the way, it also applies to other minority characters, but I am only focusing on the queer characters. A lot of us are claiming that we got queerbaited in this final season of Stranger Things. The most common response I've seen to that is that no, this wasn't queerbait, because Mike has always been straight and in love with Eleven. People who say this are clearly either surface-level viewers, or they are too heteronormative to realize that the fact that Mike is not only never explicitly stated to be straight, but also very queer-coded, is the whole reason why we believed in Byler, and why we believe now that we got willfully deceived. But before I get into that, let me also just point out what the definition of queerbaiting is. Queerbaiting is the practice of incorporating apparently or potentially queer characters or relationships into a film, television show, etc., as a means of attracting or appealing to queer audiences, while remaining deliberately coy or ambiguous about the character's sexuality, so as to not scare off homophobic audiences. Let me make two things clear here. First, queerbaiting is meant for queer audiences specifically, so for straight people not to notice it right away or at all is part of its intention. That doesn't mean that they have to remain ignorant to it though, or that they, even worse, should deny it. Secondly, this definition does not really apply to Will, it applies to Mike more so. They used Mike to queerbait. Those of us who could read the queer signals were supposed to get baited. And they used Will to pretend that they were inclusive, when in reality, the way they ended his character arc was downright homophobic. The writing for Will basically transcended queerbait and turned into blatant homophobia instead. But I'll get into that. Let me focus on Mike first. In season 1, we hear more than one character imply that Will's disappearance was the result of a homophobic hate crime. We see how Mike reacts to vile homophobic comments made against Will, and we also hear comments from Ted Wheeler with the implication that Mike is gay too, and that he should be careful not to be the next victim of a hate crime. Then there's the fact that Mike falls in love with Eleven, a girl who could be passing as a boy, and who several characters mistake for a boy. The theory here was that Mike very possibly unconsciously already knew he likes boys, but since his environment has made it clear that two boys shouldn't be together, he settles for the socially acceptable thing, falling in love with a girl who looks like a boy. Now all of this can be easily dismissed, but it's just the beginning of the queer potential in Mike's character. In season 2, they make it a point to highlight how special and intimate the relationship between Mike and Will is. The two get separated from the rest of the group, not just in the physical sense, but also because they tell each other things that they don't trust anyone else with. Their love and care for one another is meant to stand out, and possibly as more than friendship. Season 3 is where a very obvious shift takes place in Mike's character. All he seems to care about is making out with Eleven, and yet he doesn't care enough to be honest with her after Hopper tries to separate them. He doesn't care enough to make things right and apologize to her as soon as he can. Instead, he lies to her and complains about her behind her back. Keep in mind that this is the season where we actually first get to see how Mike and Eleven are in a romantic relationship, since Mike didn't make his interest clear until the end of season 1, and they spent most of season 2 being apart. In other words, they seem to make it a point to show that Mike and Elle aren't actually that good of a couple once they properly get to be one. Then there's also the fact that Mike is very dismissive towards Will, but at the same time, when conflict arises between him and Will, Mike takes immediate action to apologize and to reconcile. A stark contrast to how he treats conflict with his girlfriend. And this is something we're shown even more in the next season. At the end of season 3, Eleven kisses Mike when they say their goodbyes, but Mike keeps his eyes open during that kiss and has a strange expression on his face afterwards. Many of us interpreted that as his gay awakening, which would explain why he's awkward around Will and so emotionally distant with Eleven in the next season. Season 4 is easily the one with the most overt queer coding for Mike's character. It starts with Eleven mentioning a painting Will has been drawing in her letter to Mike. She lets Mike know that Will hasn't let her see the painting, and she therefore assumes he must be drawing it for someone that he likes. And the next thing we see is Mike awkwardly failing to hug Will at the airport and seemingly ignoring him for the rest of the day. This comes across as such obvious jealousy or even possessiveness, but at the same time also internalized homophobia, as if he isn't self-accepting enough to admit he has romantic feelings for Will and to act on those feelings, but at the same time, he also doesn't want Will to so much as be interested in someone else. The mere idea makes him jealous, which is why he creates awkward distance between them and also mistreats his girlfriend. In that same episode, Mike also defensively calls himself and Will friends, completely unprompted, which is something that directly parallels canon couples on the show, calling themselves friends right before they get together. Mike and Will reconcile pretty easily after their argument at the skating rink and spend most of the rest of the season together, while Eleven has her own separate storyline, but not before she and Mike have a fight that remains unresolved. This season makes it clear that Will loves Mike in the way Mike wants to be loved, and Mike loves and treats Will in a way that is so understanding and gentle, so obviously contrary to how he treats his girlfriend. Even in the end, Mike only tells Eleven what she wants to hear because Will urges him to. Not of his own volition, not because he actually means it. That and the fact that Mike and Eleven don't resolve any of their issues by the end of the season, and the tension between them just sits there, made it seem like the story was headed for a romance between Mike and Will. But season 5 then very intentionally misleads fans, or specifically shippers. The fight that Mike and Elle quote-unquote couldn't come back from does not get addressed. Eleven ignoring Mike at the end of season 4 does not get addressed. Will lying about Elle's feelings to Mike does not get addressed. Mike's relationship with Eleven as well as with Will is shown to be ambiguous, intentionally so. Up until the very last episode when Mike suddenly becomes a loving boyfriend to Eleven again. This was very obviously done to keep all the shippers watching until the very end. There's literally no other reason for it. We as fans try to give depth and complexity to the character of Mike by reading him as someone who is queer but repressing his romantic feelings for Will due to internalized homophobia. This would have explained his awkward behavior around Will and his bad treatment of Eleven. This would have also fit well with the analogy of the 4 kid characters representing different teenage fears, with Mike being the one to represent the fear of change. But like so many other great fan theories that are out there, it didn't come to be. And I've seen people argue that Mike was just a typical teenage boy and that explains why he was a bad boyfriend to Elle and a partially bad friend to Will. Clearly, the writers agreed with that idea, but I find it incredibly disappointing. Saying, oh, he was behaving like any teenage boy would, is just cheap. This may work in real life, but this is a fictional character in a TV show that we're talking about. The characters, especially the main characters, are supposed to have overarching character arcs throughout the whole show. But in Mike's case, he doesn't. He becomes stagnant after season 2. He has a change of heart for no discernible reason in season 3. And in season 5, he gets sidelined and barely shows any emotions or reacts to anything. None of that gets explained or justified in a satisfying way. So the character of Mike essentially gets ruined in canon. That is not to say that internalized homophobia would have made Mike a perfect character, but it absolutely had the potential of making him a more emotional and more profound one. But clearly, the fandom put more thought into his character than the writers did. Next, I want to talk about Will and the unfortunately homophobic writing of his character. I am someone who noticed the implications of Will being gay in season 1, but I didn't think much of it. I strongly assumed that there's no way they would include queer representation in a show that is set in the 1980s. I was really baffled when in season 3, Mike tells Will, "It's not my fault you don't like girls." But I was still doubtful as to whether they were actually going to explicitly write Will as gay or not. But then, to my shock and surprise, they do so in season 4, particularly through the van scene, in which Will basically sacrificed his own love, his own feelings, in order to reassure Mike in his relationship with Eleven. I quite liked that scene, and back then it made me really appreciate this slow and subtle build-up of Will's queerness. I remember thinking this is basically the opposite of Queerbait. Given how Will's story ultimately ends, that thought is now rather ironic. Because in season 5, they completely betray Will's character. First off, they make him start the season by trying to flirt with Mike, even though Mike is still in a relationship. This goes against Will's entire season 4 story arc, since he literally sacrifices his own feelings for the sake of their relationship in that season. And now all of a sudden he wants to actively break them up and tries flirting with a taken boy. Not only does this reinforce negative stereotypes about queer people, it's also out of character for Will specifically. To be fair, after volume 1 of this last season, a lot of us theorized that Mike and Elle had broken up in between seasons. And if that had been the case, Will's flirting attempts would have been fine, of course. But it wasn't. So they really just made Will act out of character with his flirting. Not only that, they also had Robin basically give Will a checklist of things he needed to do before dating someone. Step 1, self-acceptance, which we basically got to see at the end of episode 4. Step 2, coming out, which we got to see at the end of episode 7. And step 3, being brave enough to confess to someone and ideally dating them. From a narrative point of view, it made absolutely no sense to put such strong emphasis on this checklist only to let Will give up at step 2. Because near the end of the season, during his coming out scene, Will's attitude completely changes, and he just gives up. He basically rejects himself. His previously hopeful attitude vanishes. I've seen the argument that whatever Wagner showed Will must have been horrible enough to crush all of his hopes. But if that were the case, why didn't they show it? They put in too much work to create that narrative thread, so they should have put in the same amount of work to destroy it again. Instead, they rushed through it. We never get a chance to resolve any of the lies or the tension between Mike and Will. We never even address the painting lie, so Mike is still living with the illusion that Will's feelings were Eleven's. Will just gives up. And of course the writing tries to justify it, but how? By reducing Will's love to a mere crush. And you gotta ask yourself, why does only the gay kid get this kind of treatment in his romantic storyline? And what kind of message is that sending? Because what I'm seeing here is the notion that queer love isn't real love. It's just a shallow affection that one can easily get over, except in season 4, Will's love was treated as such. Basically, Will's love for Mike was allowed to be real love when it got used as a plot device to fix a straight relationship. But as soon as said love got in the way of that same straight relationship, it got reduced to being a simple crush and something he just needed to get over in order to accept himself. And that's what Will's whole character amounts to. He's gay, but he accepts that about himself in the end. Because God forbid we give the gay main character something more interesting to do or a satisfying romantic storyline. No, queer people only deserve self-acceptance, nothing more. As far as the coming out scene itself goes, most fans have criticized it, but I think for the wrong reasons. They call it unnecessary, misplaced, too time-consuming, but I think the real problem with it is that it is the opposite of empowering. Coming out is supposed to be about simply announcing your truth at your own time, of your own volition. You don't have to need to beg for acceptance. You've already accepted yourself and you're just putting your true self out there. But in Will's case, he gets forced to come out of fear and basically begs for acceptance. Now, as if all of these messages weren't bad enough, it actually gets worse for Will in the epilogue. It is implied that Will moves away to get a happy ending by moving into a city where he is more accepted, and then finds some dude to be with in a random gay bar. And that just goes against everything that Will's character has been established to be. He is introverted, shy, and he also actually has a personality outside of being gay. He's an artist. He cares deeply about his friends and family. His abusive father was an alcoholic, so why would Will start frequenting bars? Not to mention that he has already been accepted by his friends and family, so why would he need to move somewhere else for acceptance? Will also made it a point to tell Mike that he won't find a new party to play D&D with at the end of Season 3. That's how much he cares about his friends in Hawkins. But the writers throw his entire characterization out the window and literally just reduce him to his sexuality for some fake happy ending. In the end, the gay kid doesn't get to be anything other than just gay. So I hope you understand what I mean when I say Will's writing is homophobic. I talked about the narrative choices because I definitely think that those weigh the most, but I think it's worth pointing out that obviously not only the writing is supposed to be intentional, there's also the directing, the acting, the music, and even the costume design that plays into it. I won't go into detail here, but I just want to point out that one can pay attention to it and inevitably notice things. Why did Mike stare at Will's lips in so many scenes? Or rather, why did the directors choose those takes to include into the final cut? Why do certain frames of Mike and Will parallel those of other couples? Why does romantic or hopeful music play in certain scenes between them? Why does Argyle point out that Mike is wearing a knockoff shirt? Was it to imply that Mike is pretending to be someone or something that he is not? Even if you want to dismiss the queer subtext within the writing, dismissing that and every other aspect that makes Mike a queer-coded character and his and Will's relationship a potentially romantic one is objectively unreasonable. There's too much, and at least some of it has to be intentional. All of these creators, the whole team, are professionals after all. They know what they are doing. Now, even if someone is willing to deny all of that, everything that is within the show basically, there's still more. And that is the external queerbaiting, so to say. The way that the writers and the cast were very aware of the Byler fandom and our theories, but they refused to clearly shut our ship down. Mind you, I don't blame the actors. They were most likely just following orders, so to say. They got told not to say anything about it, so I don't blame them. But I absolutely blame everyone who was above them, so to say. The writers and directors and whichever people are running the official social media accounts for Stranger Things and Netflix. When asked about Byler, the writers purposefully kept their answers vague. I can say with absolute certainty that if they had made any statement or given any reply that explicitly said that they have no intention of making Byler canon, none of us would be calling it queerbait. There would still be things we'd be confused about within the writing. We definitely still have questions, and we would have been disappointed for sure, but we wouldn't have needed to hold our breath until the very last second of the show, hoping for the representation that we believed we saw and that meant so much to so many of us. But they didn't do that. That was undisputably intentional. They wanted to string us along for as long as possible because they wanted our views. And going back to the definition of queerbaiting, this is it. They even seemed to make a mockery of all of us in the final episode when they had Mike say the lines, "Friends, no thanks," a beat, "best friends." Saying that to your friend who literally just came out to you and who you now know was in love with you is so insensitive. It seriously seemed like that line was not only to queerbait us, but also rage bait us one last time. The most egregious part of all this is that the writers are clearly taking unmerited pride in being oh so inclusive. They claim that this show is a love letter for the outcasts and the marginalized, but the way they write minority characters contradicts that. Not to mention how the ending only catered to the bullies, or the homophobes. They only wrote their version of good representation. And in the case of queer representation, that meant writing a gay boy whose trauma they were willing to show season after season, but whose happiness and romantic potential they refused to explore for more than necessary. They didn't even listen to Noah's suggestion more than once, even though Noah is gay himself. He's the one who added that scene between Mike and Will in the last episode, which isn't even that good of a scene. But it just goes to show how much he cares that he wanted there to be some sort of conclusion. And then he had more to say, but the writers literally shut him down. They told him you only get one chance. And you gotta ask yourself, if this is how the writers treat a queer person that works for them, then it's really unsurprising that they treated their queer audience so much worse. But still, they unironically just keep patting themselves on the backs for their supposedly good representation. So I'm honestly kind of torn at this point. Was the writer's queerbait and homophobia actually intentional, or are they just so incredibly dense that they didn't realize the impact and implications of what they wrote? This is basically the only argument I'd be willing to indulge from anyone who claims that this wasn't queerbait, because I definitely believe it was. But if you're trying to argue with me that it wasn't, then, well, you're only going to convince me if you're trying to say that the writers were just too dang stupid. Because clearly it's become more and more evident that writing in Stranger Things does not reward analytical thinking or paying attention to details. I think it is completely justified to be hurt or angry over the queerbaiting, but honestly, there's also a part of me that has reached a point where I'm actually kind of glad that they didn't make Byler canon. Because just like they did with literally everything else on the show, I'm willing to bet that they would have found a way to ruin that relationship too.